Hello. Welcome to Why Not Both, the podcast all about how our multiple passions and interests shape our identity and our lives. My name is Pam Schaefer, and I am a musician and therapist in Los Angeles, and I also happen to be your host. This podcast is produced by Laura Studeris, and for this season, we've partnered up with Under the Radar magazine. If you like what you hear, you can hang out with us on social media. We are on Twitter and Instagram at WNB the podcast. And if you really, really like what you hear, please support us on Patreon. We are under Why Not Both podcast. When you join our Patreon, you get a whole bunch of really cool behind the scenes stuff and you get to chat with us. And that's pretty awesome. Thank you so much for your support, and I hope you enjoy our interviews. For this week's episode, we talked to Hrishikesh Hirway. You might know him from his wonderful music or his fantastic array of podcasts. My personal favorite is Song Exploder. I hope that you enjoy our interview. Welcome to Why Not Both, where we're well acquainted with the creepy Zoom robot voice now.
Yeah.
It's cool. It's fine. I saw that you had like a Rode pop filter, and I was curious about what microphone you had.
Oh yeah, it is a Rode NT1.
So good. Oh, good. This fills my heart with joy. And when you said prior to recording that you were like, oh yeah, I do a stream, I was just like, what is that experience like? Like, because your podcast started, I think, in like 2014, and it seems like everything has kind of like Katamari snowballed since then.
Mm-hmm.
Can you speak to what that experience has been like, especially like in the past year or so, because everything's changed so much?
To which part specifically?
I guess like you were talking about that you stream on your Patreon and stuff like that. Like, when did that start? And I guess like what's that all like?
Yeah. So I started a podcast in 2016 called The West Wing Weekly.
Mm-hmm.
That was a show that was like an episode by episode discussion of the TV show The West Wing that I hosted with my friend Josh Molina, who was an actor who was on the show. And we went through all 154 episodes of the series, and that ended January of 2020. We had a finale in LA at the Ace Theater, and it was great, and the timing was amazing because at that time, it was right before the pandemic hit, and then the project ended, and we didn't really know if we were going to do anything else at that point. But then time kind of passed, and a few months ago, my co-host Josh has been saying to me, let's do something else. Like, maybe we should start another project. Maybe it's another podcast. What are we going to do? And I wasn't really sure, and I wasn't really eager to take on another podcast project because I had started other things in the wake of the West Wing Weekly ending.
Mm-hmm.
So I kind of have always had 2 to 3 to 4 different sort of podcast projects going since then. And so the idea of taking on something else was too daunting for me. But then I suggested this idea of us doing a sort of director's commentary style live watch of another show by Aaron Sorkin, who had made West Wing, that Josh Molina had also starred in, like the West Wing, which is a show called Sports Night. It's a 30-minute comedy that only lasted 2 seasons, and doesn't have sort of the same kind of depth of issues, and there wasn't as much to talk about in that show as there is in the West Wing, because
Right.
in the West Wing we talked to not just the people who made the show, but we talked to people in government who worked on the issues that the different episodes of the show kind of dealt with.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So it was pretty broad ranging, but this is just like, it's a pretty fun, like, nice comedy, dramedy or something. And so I said, well, maybe we could just watch it and talk about it, and not put it out there as basically, can we do something together that isn't as much work as putting out a weekly hour-long research-based podcast?
Yes.
And so this Patreon project that's called Unnecessary Commentary is what came out of that.
That's phenomenal. And when you said like putting out an hour-long researched podcast, I feel that people who create podcasts and people who create things like that understand how much work goes into it. But I'm not sure that like the average listener might. And it's not that they want to discredit you. It's just like if you haven't done it, you don't know how much work goes into it. And when you said that you had multiple of those, I'm like, are you okay? Do you ever sleep? Like
Yeah.
blink twice if you need help. Like,
Yeah, it's been pretty busy for the last 5 to 7 years.
yeah. How did you feel about balancing that kind of creative output with you just put out your own music and you were touring with another person that we had on the pod, Jenny Owen Youngs. Did I just say her name in the right order?
Jenny Owen Youngs. You just
Thank
put the
you.
S in the other place.
I was just like, something went wrong in the translation from my brain to then speaking. And I was like, but yeah, I was talking with her about the different forms of creativity that it takes to, you know, like make a pod and then also then working on songs, and that it's this interesting like gear shift. I guess what was your experience with that? Because you did just put out, you know, you've got music out.
Yeah. Um, for me, the only way that I was able to make room for music again after being away from it for a while was to put physical, blocks up in my life, so that I could. So I made a decision, that I needed to make music again, and I needed to kind of schedule it. And as unintuitive as that felt, um, I knew that if I didn't do that, I just wouldn't. I wouldn't make music. So
Yeah.
so in 2020, that was kind of when I saw a little crack of daylight, because the West Wing podcast had ended, and also the last of the Netflix version of Song Exploder had come out.
Mm-hmm.
So those were two huge projects that had been on my plate that that I could cross off the list. So at that point, I said, okay, I'm going to try and start uh, dedicating just Fridays out of the week to making music. I'll, and I didn't really have less work, but I just decided to squeeze all of my work into the other remaining 6 days and leave at least one day free for working on music. So that was the only way that I was able to get there, um, and it was hard.
Yeah. Yeah. The way that you speak of it reminds me of in my I was like, in my life when I am not doing music or podcasting, I run a therapy business and I do see clients and whatnot. And it's interesting talking to clients about scheduling intimacy, because
Yeah,
they think that like you're scheduling like it's like, and now the sex at 4 p.m. And you're like, no, 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 no. It's like it's the same thing as scheduling time with music, where it's like you're scheduling time to make room for that. And it's because so much of the rest of what goes on in our life is like there's certain necessities, but there's also things that are very compelling. But it's like if you actually schedule time for that, that allows it to actually emerge in your life. Whereas if you
yeah,
don't make room for it, even if you like that thing or you know that thing's important, sometimes it gets smushed out of the way. And
yeah,
so what was that like to get reacquainted with music? Like when you're like, haha, today is music day. Like,
yeah. I think I felt the same exact way as what you described. Is I just needed to create the opportunity for potential, and I had been too acquainted with a life where I didn't have that potential. I thought maybe maybe a song would come to me again. Maybe I don't know. But it felt like a muscle that had atrophied, and I wasn't sure if it was gone forever.
mm,
Um, and what happened was that Jenny um, approached me about co-writing a song with her, and that was actually the perfect way to get back into things, and to try and refamiliarize myself with the process, because um, in some ways it reduced some of the pressure for me, because it wasn't my song, and I had faith that she would kind of see it through, even if I was only able to add a little bit, or not at all or something like that.
Mm.
But I said yes because it felt like very safe circumstances to try my hand, um, and it was really nice. And that's that experience is what gave me, I think, a sense that like no, that muscle isn't gone completely. It's just been out of use.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, it can feel really scary when you're hopping back in. Like, I feel very fortunate that like I was like, my piano is behind me, so you can see I play the piano. um, but there, even if like, a few days go by that I don't have time to really seriously sit down and play, I sometimes like psych myself out, or I'm just like, what if I sit down at the piano and I don't know how to play anything? And it's like, Pam, you've been playing since you were 5 years old. Like, I don't think you're going to suddenly forget how to play the piano. Um, but having that experience of like having a safe place to go back to it, because when you haven't done that for a while, you're like, can I do this thing? It's a
Yeah.
weird vulnerability thing.
Yeah. I think what made it complicated for me was that I was making Song Exploder, which is a show that was born out of my experience as a musician, and is entirely made from the fabric of what I've learned by being a musician. Um, it is a very musical show, like the edits and the mixing and all that stuff. It is. I'm engaging with my music skills all the time making that show. Um, and the way I interview other artists about their work comes from a sense of empathy, born out of my own experiences. But you know, it's really more theoretical. Like my existence as a musician in some ways feels more theoretical, or at least publicly it feels more theoretical, because it's like, oh, I'm a musician who makes this music podcast, and it's like, well, I've made I've made music in the years that I've been making Song Exploder, but it's been music essentially for hire. I scored
Mhm.
a TV show. I've made theme songs for things. I did the music for a video game. I've done music projects, but it's not quite the same as being an artist in the way that
Mhm.
I was used to, where I was touring and playing shows and making something that was wholly my own. Um,
Right.
I wasn't existing as an artist the same way that the people who I was talking to on the show exist as artists. And sometimes people would say, "Oh, I didn't realize you made music," and that was kind of devastating.
Wow. That what you're expressing resonates so much with me, in that like the pod over the last at least year really took over so much of my creative landscape, that I had that experience too, where people would say, oh wow, I didn't know that you made music too.
Hmm.
And the way that you spoke of like the identity of the artist, like you can make music for yourself. And I did similar things to you, where I was scoring friends' video art and things like that. But it's very different when you have that piece of your identity as a public artist, as your own kind of entity.
Yeah.
That then when someone says, oh, I didn't know you made music, in a way, what they mean is, I didn't know that you were an artist in the same way I was. But at least when I hear that, I'm just like, like, is that piece of my identity gone? Or like, is it not legible to people? Or like, the spiral. Um,
Yeah. Yeah.
the spiral begins. Uh, and yeah, like hearing about that, it does sound like, those other parts of your identity kind of were in the forefront for a while, but it didn't mean that you weren't a musician. It just meant that you weren't a musician in the way that sometimes it sounds like other people might conceptualize a musician, that we perceive them as like the kind of artist you're talking about.
Yeah, including me.
Yeah. Yeah. It's funny that you bring that up in light of, I just realized, I was like, you produce Shirley Manson's podcast, right?
Or I created it basically. I helped create
Yeah.
it. So I'm the executive producer. There are other people who actually do the heavy lifting of production on it, though.
Got it. Because I I spoke to her last summer when I was displaced from my home due to ceiling construction. So I was in a blanket fort that my friends made for me, so I would have good sound at their house. It was very cute. So I was just like, talking to Shirley Manson from Blanket Fort. That is on my agenda today. Like, what a life. But she was mentioning about that she didn't realize in her constellation of her identity that she could be a podcast host, or that she could explore things like this. And it's fascinating to me that like you felt almost this devastation of like, oh, am I an artist in this way? Where she expressed almost the opposite, where she was perceived solely as an artist, that then kind of your idea that empowered her to perceive herself in a different way.
Yeah.
And I was like, what have you ever heard?
Yeah. Sometimes you just need another person to show you the way they see you for you to see yourself that way.
Yeah. Yeah. Like that's really powerful what you did. I was just like, thumbs up.
Thanks. It was a no-brainer for me because I did feel like she would be a natural at it, and I think she is.
Oh yeah. She and I were talking about how like when you interview someone, it's like you have, as she put it, she's like, I feel like I fall in love with every podcast guest. Where like
Yeah.
you learn something new each time and you just become like so enchanted by being in that person's world that it's like, because it's rare actually that we get to even have conversations like this. Like I feel very fortunate that in some ways I do because of my other job.
Right.
But it's rare that you get to actually just be like, hey, I'm gonna sit down for an hour and just really focus in on talking to this person.
Yeah.
Um and so she was just like, yeah, my husband thinks I'm going to run off with like every podcast guest. And I am. I was like, that's too funny. What did you find? I'm curious what you found coming back to writing, like, with Jenny. Like, did you find that you crafted things differently after talking to everybody that you did on Song Exploder? Like, how did those two kind of like intertwine?
I think the biggest thing is that what I realized I was most compelled by in Song Exploder was the songs and that contained stories where people really wove their own identity in a really profound way. The things that I'm always looking for in those episodes is for someone to reveal some part of who they are. Even if it only comes through in this little bit, through this tiny little peephole of this song, um, I want to feel like I get to know some true part of who they are. And so I'm constantly asking. People ask me like, how do you choose which songs are going to be on the podcast? And uh, and the answer is that I'm always looking for a song that has a lot of personal significance to the
Mm,
artist. And so I ask about that. And I say, what's the song what's a song on this album that means a lot to you? And it might not be the biggest hit or the lead single or whatever, but sometimes it is. But while that might be the priority of the label or the publicist, for me, it's about finding this chance to get to know the way someone thinks and something about their life that gets expressed in a song. So when it came time to making songs in this kind of era of my life, I wanted to make songs that reflected myself in that way.
mm,
Whereas I think earlier in my life, I was more okay, or rather even more excited about the idea of like some kind of, poetic allegory or metaphor or something like that, something that I could talk about that was like my own life felt too small
mm,
to write songs about, and the idea of connecting to bigger ideas or more beautiful ideas or something. I felt like I had to travel somewhere through the lyrics or through the thing to get to that.
mm.
Um, and I think as I got older and as I got further along with songwriting, I started to slowly peel back some of that stuff and put a little bit more of myself in a more direct way. There'd be lines where like this is about a very specific moment, but not necessarily like the entire song.
Right.
Whereas here I said this time I thought no, I'm just gonna um, let this be a way for me to engage and process with what's going on in my life, and uh, use my life in my music and use the music to help with my life.
Do you have, when you're talking to people, do you have almost a pre-interview with them, or do you have like a knack for discerning which songs have personal meaning?
Um, I do ask because I feel like they're going to know better than anybody,
Yeah.
based on but sometimes artists are extremely effective in their lyric writing and their music making where you can listen to something and you're like, I feel like I'm getting something really uh, really revealing about who they are in this song. And so if I ever get that feeling, then those tend to be the songs that I'm most drawn to for the show.
And that's really fascinating that then it inspired you to do the same. Like I feel similarly that, and especially thinking about like the structure of Song Exploder and things like that. I remember even when I learned music theory, I was afraid for a while that it would take away from like the magic of music if I
Hmm.
learned. And then I was like, oh no, it's just the vocabulary of how to describe what I know exists, and that's well and good. But I found that I was more guarded in my writing because I wanted to cloak it in kind of like interesting things or
Yeah.
mythologizing of things, like all this stuff. And then after a while, it's just like, do I listen to something and think, wow, they've really crafted their story in an artful mythology, or do I want to connect with the story?
Yeah.
Um, and so that's a fascinating kind of like parallel there. And I was thinking about, I don't recall if it was Amanda Palmer talking about Neil Gaiman or Neil Gaiman talking about Amanda Palmer, but they were talking about when you put stuff in your art blender, it's like, is your blender set to a coarse chop? Are you making a salsa where you can see like each of the things that were in there, or have you made like gazpacho? Like, and so it's like, or do you not know? And so like he was talking about how his art blender is more of the soup variety or the smoothie, where you know that there's elements of his life in there, but you don't know exactly what they are.
Yeah.
Whereas like she was saying that like hers is more of like a coarse chop, you could actually see which are the bits from her life that like went into this composition. And it's an interesting balance trying to find that. Because also there's songs like that I thought were very personal that people have then revealed were like stories or characters that they made up,
Right.
like the Simon and Garfunkel song For Emily Wherever I May Find Her was like one of my favorite songs as a child. And I
Yeah.
always wondered like who she was. And then when I learned that it was about this like romantic ideal, I was like, what? And like in a way I was excited, but I also felt cheated. But I was also like, I was like, you fooled me, but what a good trick.
Yeah.
Like, oh my gosh. I guess how does it feel playing these songs for people? Because you've been out on tour, right?
Yeah. I just got back this weekend from my first tour dates for this new record.
Welcome back. I was like, I don't know if you're in LA as well. I always just presume I'm like, welcome back home. And then I was like, wait, Pam, not everybody lives in LA.
I am. I am in LA.
Yay, so am I. Oh, good. Did you enjoy the rain this morning? It was very beautiful.
I mean, I was on the East Coast for a tour, so I was actually really looking forward to some real California weather and not this drizzle.
Well, fortunately, it appeared from the weather app today to be the day of rain. And then like everything else was fine. It's having grown up here, like LA rain, it seems to work like that, where it's just like it's either absolutely no rain or like more rain than one could ever imagine, and it's biblical, and then it stops. And
Yeah.
you're like, well, there it went. Well, I'm sorry that you came back on the rainy day, but how was that? And also, what is touring like currently? Like, I know a few people have been back out on tour, but like, it seems like there's a really interesting variety of experience. And in some ways, it's a very visceral experience getting to reconnect with audiences too.
Well, I think a lot of people who are going out on tour right now are comparing it to what it was like in 2019 or early 2020. But for me, the last time I went on tour was in 2011.
Oh,
So my frame of reference is very different. I haven't put out music in a decade. And
yeah.
and so I really my my the changes that I have to track are across so many different quadrants that I don't really know how to answer the question because it was it was very overwhelming. Also, the shows that Jenny and I were playing are different from any other shows that I've ever done. They
Hmm.
were kind of a cross between a concert and a live podcast in some ways, and which I've done much more of. In the last few years, I've done a lot more podcast events than I've done. Well, I haven't done any concerts. Um, so yeah, it was actually quite nice to try and figure out the balance between this version of playing shows from years ago and this version of how I've existed on a stage more recently.
Hmm. And do you find, I guess, when you're performing music versus podcasts, like what for you feels different when you're connecting with an audience?
Well, when you're playing a song, there's a certain set of notes and words that you're supposed to sing in a certain order, and when you're talking, there isn't. So it's a lot easier to figure out if you've done it right or if you've done it wrong when you're playing a song, or at least I certainly can as the performer, and I think the audience can too. Whereas when you're doing a live podcast, it's more um, improvised, it's looser, and it's a little more dynamic. Usually with a song, the audience has to wait until the end to give their reaction. And when you're talking, they might react from word to word or sentence to sentence. So it does feel like a different level of connection, a different kind of frequency.
That makes sense. And yeah, that's funny what you said about, when you did it right or wrong. I was thinking about that as a performer, I put so much pressure on myself sometimes to do everything quote right. But I think that just comes from learning classical piano when I was a kid. Whereas I have noticed that I'll go to shows and I'll hear what I can perceive like technical flaws, but it doesn't interrupt my enjoyment of the show. Whereas like if I go with friends who like aren't in music or anything like that, all they're focused on is like, are they having a good emotional time? They might notice if like, say like an amp falls over or like something like that, they're going to notice something like going catastrophically wrong, but they're not going to notice like anything that like we might notice where we're like, oh, I messed up that phrasing. Like as long
Yeah.
as they're in the emotional moment, they won't pick up on that.
Yeah.
And so that's interesting that that's your experience, like as a performer of that. And like in a way also with sharing songs, like, do you feel like it's more vulnerable to share the songs that you've written, or do you feel like it's more vulnerable to be like in that dynamic, like podcasting space on stage?
Well, one of the things that was really exciting about this tour is that it felt like a culmination, like an interweaving of all these different kind of what sort of feel like disparate parts of who I am. Um,
Mhm.
Both part of me that makes songs, the part of me that makes Song Exploder, and then the part of me that makes sort of chattier podcasts like The West Wing Weekly and Home Cooking,
Mhm.
where I get to be, I don't know, it's a little looser and more fun. Um, and Song Exploder is about these kinds of hidden emotional ideas that maybe get buried in a song that on first listen you wouldn't hear about. But what was so nice was getting to talk about those kinds of stories, but do it in a format that felt closer to a fun, chattier podcast because I was on stage with Jenny the whole time. But what we were talking about ultimately was, um, these what are these very vulnerable songs for me? These very raw songs um, about loss and grief and love for me. So it was really exciting for me to be able to like have people laugh with me at things that I'm saying, while telling a story that ultimately is going to end in a very sad song, and then pick them back up with the next story afterwards.
I always love that. Like Tori Amos tells stories between her songs. And I remember like I'm excited. I think she's gonna be in LA in June. Um, but I always really like that about her performance style is that her songs have this like wide ranging emotional intensity. But in between the songs, she brings so much like humor and humanity to what's going on because I don't know if I could handle like a whole Tori Amos concert without like Tori stories in between things. Like, and so I like that you're bringing this like variety of emotional landscape. And it sounds like it helped you feel comfortable too, that you ended up being able to unite these parts of yourself that you felt were like potentially disparate parts, like how you'd expressed that like despondency when you're like, wait, I'm not being seen as a musician. Like,
Yeah, yeah. It was a way for me to get to be all of the different versions of me that I've been over the last 10 years.
that's magical because that's actually what sparked me starting this podcast was that I wanted to talk to people who do multiple things and how that informs their sense of identity because often I find that people are confused when you present something that's outside their schema of you and they don't really know how to incorporate it, and it's not that they're
Yeah.
hostile to it but they're more just like qua.
Yeah.
So I'm like, oh, I'm delighted that you found a way to put all of those together. That sounds like it feels really good.
It did. It
Like,
really did. Yeah, and we have more shows coming up in May. So when we tour on the West Coast, so I'm excited that we figured that out and that it's not over yet.
Yes. Yes. Yeah. I was just like, that's super cool. And also, like you said, like hearing people's immediate reactions to things, that's what can be so tricky sometimes about at least like this format, is that you and I are having this moment, but then later other people are going to have moments with this moment. And
Yeah.
obviously it's the same with recorded music as well. And it's like, I'm personally like more of a studio rat. So I love just crafting weird, 70 tracks of whale sounds, like whatever strikes my fancy in the moment. I love creating that. And then I forget sometimes, I'm like, oh yeah, someone else is going to have an experience with this. And live, you see that. But like, for instance, I've never done a live podcasting event. And now I'm so curious what that's like.
Hmm.
Like,
It's it's pretty interesting. I mean, um, Song Exploder live events are very different from West Wing Weekly live events. Um, with the West Wing Weekly, which I think is closer to what most podcasts kind of experience, which is a sense of community
yeah.
around, where you can have like running jokes and you can have a mythology, like you said, that you've built over the course of things. Whereas Song Exploder is essentially an anthology series. Every episode kind of stands alone.
Yeah.
So it's quite different. People are there. I think they're curious and they're excited. They might be interested in the artist or the podcast, but you don't really know. But with something like the West Wing Weekly, it was wild to see how much people wanted to engage with our show, the podcast, about a show. It's not even like the podcast was the primary material. The West Wing was the
Yeah.
primary material, and we were just this sort of secondary layer of commentary around it.
That almost it pinged in my mind. My sister had sent me the podcast, My Dad Wrote a Porno.
Hmm.
And like I thought of that in that context of like, yes, of course the text that they're reading is hysterically funny just as is, but people then form relationships with the people who are commentating. It's like this like double layer thing that then I'm just like, oh, that's so fascinating. I hadn't thought about it that way. That then the community is actually based around your experience of it, but it's their experiences of you experiencing it.
Yeah.
Like, it's like, oh, that's fascinating. Because I tend to listen to more of like Song Exploder or things like that, or like the Knowledge Project, or like my friend Amanda's podcast Between the Worlds, where it's like, and that's more about like tarot and whatnot. But it's like I tend to listen to things that are more, I guess, like informative or knowledge based. I like how you said it's like an anthology. And that's fascinating that you do both, because then you can feel what it feels like when people react to both of those.
Yeah. Yeah. I'm more comfortable in the Song Exploder version of things where I'm not in the show and it's highly edited. But I understood the value that having that kind of chatty dynamic um, has on its own, and I got to have a lot of fun with it. And so in 2020, when the pandemic hit, I started this podcast called Home Cooking with my friend Samin Nosrat, and that that knowledge from the West Wing Weekly really played into the making of that show. I thought, okay, this is the right container for the two of us to um, give people information.
And when you started podcasting originally, like, was that something that you'd had a passion for before, or was it kind of on a lark that you just like fell into it? Or like, how did that begin as someone who, like you said, you were doing more like touring music stuff and like things like that? I was like, what? I'm like, what's the origin story?
It was a little bit of a lark. I listened to a few podcasts, not a ton. Um, I, I'd listened to a bunch of This American Life, and I'd listened to years and years earlier. I'd listened to the Ricky Gervais podcast when that first
Oh,
came out, and it
wow.
was like that was the first time I'd heard the word podcast. In 2006, I think it was, and um, and then in 2012 or so, I started listening to podcasts as something that like became part of my listening, uh, a- um, became part of my listening routine, I guess, along with
Mhm.
music. And it was after that, after getting into them in 2012, that I started thinking about um, ideas that I'd had around Song Exploder taking shape in that medium.
Got it. I was like, that's so interesting. Like, because I think of why people start the projects that they do, because I have what one of my friends dubbed the brain zoomies, where sometimes I will start something because it's caught my fancy, and then I'll be midway through and I'm like, what am I doing? But that's interesting to know that it was kind of like gestating for a while. When you were doing that, like, were you doing other occupations, or did that become like your primary occupation?
When I started Song Exploder, it was 2013, and it was right around the time when I was finishing the score for a film.
Mhm.
And I remember going to South by Southwest in 2013 for that film's premiere, and and I think I had just finished pilot episode of. I think I had just finished the pilot episode of Song Exploder at that time, where I was getting close to it. And then also at that South by Southwest, I met Lakeith Stanfield because he was there with a film called Short Term 12. And so that year, 2013 was sort of a year for me where I decided I was going to try and do projects outside of the 1 a.m. radio, which was the name of my band or my project, basically from when I was in college, and I had been trying so hard to just singularly focus on that um, because I felt like if I took my eye off the ball, I'd potentially lose momentum or who
Mm.
knows what. So, 2013, was the first time that I thought, well, what else is out there? And so I kind of gave myself permission to pull on a couple of these threads, and one of them was Song Exploder. Then one of them was a band that I started with Lakeith called Moors,
Mhm.
and then the other was a TV project that I started with my friend Josh Molina, and the TV project. Um, so all around the same time in 2013, I was working on songs with Lakeith, working on pitching this TV show with Josh and trying to find a home for Song Exploder after I made the pilot. It was a lot of potential and not a lot of actual, kinetic practical work being done. It was like a long year of incubation. Um,
Gotcha.
but then when but then at the end of 2013, Lakeith and I put out our first song. At the beginning of 2014, Song Exploder came out in January, and then the same month, Josh and I sold and shot the pilot for our TV show. So all of these things were kind of happening at once, and then that first year, like I was touring with Lakeith, and Josh and I were still trying to figure out what was going to happen with the network and our TV show, and I was making Song Exploder around it all, which is part of the reason why the episodes, I thought, let me put out 2 episodes a month and keep it to that so that I have enough room for these other things that I'm doing too.
That's very pragmatic. That's also interesting that you speak of that time in which things are in incubation, because sometimes I find that chatting with people about that, there's the outside perception that nothing is going on, but then the internal perception is so different because you know the work that you're putting into things.
Yeah.
But it's sometimes so hard to sit on things when you're in process.
Yeah. Yeah. And it's very, um, not just daydream out loud. I think for me, I like to keep things close to the chest, and because I never want it to feel like I'm just saying something, I'm going to make something, and I'm just talking a game, talking big game, and then I'm never
Mm.
able to back it up. I feel like that's something that happens a lot in LA, and so uh, I I tend to not say anything in those moments of incubation. But that means like for a year, I wasn't really talking about what I was making because I hadn't put it out into the world. It didn't feel real yet.
Yeah. That's such a tricky balance to hold because, yeah, on one hand, I am definitely in the same camp as you, where it's like, I don't want to overpromise something in a way or set up an expectation of something I'm doing before it's done, because that
Yeah.
might not match up to what I'm making. Like it might be better, it might be worse, but it's just like not an accurate expectation.
Yeah.
Um, but also if I'm too private about it, I sometimes find that I'm like, oh, is this thing actually real? Like, is this actually happening? And then sometimes when I actually put the thing out, I have a hard time connecting with the reality of other people even knowing about it, because for so long it's been like an inside thing.
Yeah.
And it's almost jarring when it's like on the outside, you're like, oh, wait, yeah, actually, like I can tell people about that
Yes.
now. It's a strange experience. And also, even like thinking about identity wise, like when we talk about, talk about who we are, I used to start the podcast by asking people, like, what do you do? And what's a better question to ask?
Hmm.
And I think I might return to that question now that our identities are slightly firmer than wobbly jello. They're not quite. um, Everyone went through a period of just like, oh no, everything has collapsed. Who am I? What's going on? And now it's just like, oh, we're rebuilding. I also am not quite sure who I am yet, but we're getting more of a picture.
Yeah.
I guess like in your mind, like what would you prefer? Like like in dinner party conversation, essentially, like whenever we eat dinner with other humans again. But like instead of someone saying, what do you do? It's like, I guess what would be more compelling for someone to ask you, or what would you want to ask someone else?
Hmm. Maybe something like, when you look at what you do now, what's something from your early childhood that you can point to that feels like the first evidence that would that you would end up doing what you do now?
Oh, I love that. What's the first bit of evidence from your childhood that's indicative of something that you're doing now?
Yeah.
Wow. That's such a cool question. I guess like what sparked that in your mind? Like were you thinking of something from like your childhood that informed you, or like would child you be really surprised by what's happening now?
I think for me, I was thinking about the way that I used to interact with Legos.
Hmm.
My relationship with Legos, I think, in some ways feels very connected to the way that I think about making podcasts, and maybe even more specifically the way I make Song Exploder, um, which is that I really liked the format. Essentially, I really liked the tools, um, but I also immediately threw out the manual. That was the first thing that I would do, is I would be like, I don't want, I'd get the kit and I'm like, I don't want to build this. I'm going to build my own thing.
Yes.
Um, and and the way I would try and be like be a minimalist with the color palette, and also I would make multiples of things that would all try and hopefully fit together. I mean, essentially, I was making like the Lego version of an anthology series, where I'd say like, well, here's the car, here's the spaceship, here's the little motorcycle, but they all fit together in this giant truck, and they all look the same, and they're all, like, it felt like I was trying to build something unified, um, where each piece had its own unique qualities too. Anyway,
Mhm.
I look at some of that, and I think I'm still thinking about some of those ideas. Like a lot of my goals as an 8-year-old with those Legos are the creative goals that I have now with just a different set of tools.
Yeah, it's like you're taking these potentially disparate things that actually have instructions on how to make them more disparate, and you're like, no, 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 no. You're like, you're like, thank you for this box of Legos. Let's figure out how to unify them and make a different picture here.
Exactly.
Like, I love that. That reminds me of something an art teacher said about me as a child, that all my report cards were always like, Pam always knows the answer when called on, but appears to be staring off in space. And I'm like, accurate. But this art teacher said that I appeared to have many different pictures in my mind, because when I drew things, like most kids will draw kind of variations on a theme.
Yeah.
And there were some of my favorite things that I like to draw that I would kind of practice different things over and over again. but I liked exploring so many different forms of things that I guess that was what stood out, was that it was like there wasn't like a, like, you know, most kids are like, ah, yes, I'm really interested in making cats or like things like that. They'll make, or they'll use like a similar color palette over and over again. And I was just like, oh no, we go on a journey. Like, I was like, okay, that is remarkably consistent to now, where it's like, I certainly have my favorites, but if someone's like, would you like to try this new thing? I'm like, I will try just about anything at least twice just to make sure that the first one wasn't like a fluke. Like,
Yeah.
So I love that. I love that you had like your own internal Lego logic that you're like, no, we're going to preempt this. We're going to like, that is delightful. I'm curious, like what our kid versions would make of us, like, because I don't know about you, but when I was a kid, when people would say things like, "Oh, well, what are you going to be when you grow up?" and things like that, I'd be like, "I don't know. I'm just gonna like be a person." Like, are you not a person when you grow up? That's weird. Like, I don't know. Did you have aspirations when you were a kid that like you were like, I'm going to be this, you know, insert title here? Like, was there
Yeah.
something in your mind?
I remember having to write something like this for school. You know, what are you what will you be doing at this point, you know, however many years into the future?
Yeah.
And I remember what I put, that I was going to be a cartoonist. And also I was going to do the voices for cartoon characters.
I mean, it's interesting because I was like, you kind of do analogous things. You do create the voice of different characters, but they're different aspects of yourself in songs and in podcasts.
I do, and I do talk into a microphone for a living.
Yeah. Yeah. I was like, you got pretty close. Like, I was just like, I remember on I forgot it was career day at school, which is also indicative of who I am as a human being. But once I realized I'd forgotten, I messaged one of my friends and she was just like, oh, well, I'm going to a psychic today. And I was like, I didn't know you wanted to be a psychic. She's like, I don't. I just thought that would be fun. And I was like, this is why we're friends. I forgot it was career day. You're going to a psychic. This all scans. But I was like, but what should I do on career day? She's like, I don't know. What do you want your career to be? And I was like, I don't know. I just like making songs and helping people. And she was like, well, that should just like be your career or something. And I was like, okay.
There you go.
And that was an oddly prescient thought that 17-year-old no concept of time me had.
Yeah. So there you go. That's my dinner party replacement question.
I love that. That's such an interesting idea because also it causes people to introspect on what consistencies they have, but also that it's okay to not always want the exact same thing from when you were a kid. Like if you were suddenly really sad that you were like, oh, I never drew those cartoons. Like that it's okay that sometimes your dream of something changes over time or that it becomes incorporated into another like aspiration or dream.
Yeah. I mean, I do I do mourn the fact that I never got to be a cartoonist. I would love to, but I'm just I never got good enough as a visual artist.
Yeah. And recognizing, as weird as this sounds, it takes talent to recognize maybe either a lack of talent or skill in an area. Because I think everybody, if you really work at something, you can reach a certain level of accomplishment in it.
Mm-hmm.
But it's also good to know when to be like, you know what, I tried this thing, and even though I really like this thing, there's other things that actually I have an aptitude and desire to do, and that's okay.
Yeah. Also, the cartoon that I was most influenced by at the time when I wrote this thing was Garfield, and my love of Garfield kind of dwindled over the years too.
I feel similarly. That's actually really funny. I definitely had like Garfield stuffed animals and like the little Garfield books and everything. I remember those from the Scholastic Book Fair. You could get them in a nice box. We love that for us. That's so funny. I remember drawing Garfield now that I think about it.
It was the thing to do.
It was. That's actually really funny that I'm like, both little kid us were like, Garfield, that's the way.
Yeah. Well, he was the big hit. He was the number one lead off in the Sunday comics.
Yes. Yes. And like, I don't know what it was about the distinctive style of that, but like, it still to me is more visually compelling than some of the other styles that had more kind of like, I don't know how to describe it other than like rougher line work on them. I
Hmm.
didn't find them as compelling to look at. Like, I found like Garfield and the Peanuts, like, I liked the shapes in both of those.
Yeah.
I was like, yes, this is legible to me. That's so funny. I guess like I'm like, oh, would you ever work with like an animator now? Like, would you ever like collaborate on a cartoon with someone?
Actually, the music video for the first song of mine that came out, Between There and Here, is an animated music video.
There you go.
Yeah, which I co-directed.
Childhood you, very pleased.
Yeah, he is.
Very validating. Um, I guess like what do you see coming up next in a way now that you have delved back into the music side of you? Like how do you want to balance all those different pieces of you that are out and about in the world?
Well, I think my dream would be being able to make room for music in my life in a ratio that's greater than just 1 day a week.
Yeah.
Um, and it doesn't have to be 7 days a week because I think that had its own difficulties. It's how I got stuck in the first place. But I think if I were able to figure out how to make it something that felt like a regular practice and a part of my life, while also having the room to do new things and discover new things to build without manuals, that would be the dream for me.
I like that a lot. And I relate to that a lot in that I've never done music 24/7. And I admire people who do music 24/7. Um, but I find that actually, I personally at least make better music when I'm not doing it 24/7.
Hmm.
I almost have to have like a little bit of like zoom out time away and then I can like zoom back in. Like
Yeah.
I really like right now my balance is like 2 to 3 days really of music and like podcasting leaks into that. And then podcasting kind of overlaps with like therapy days and also music days. It's kind of the little middle ground there. But having at least 2 to 3 days of like full music is really good for me because I remember when it was more like kind of 5 days. Sometimes around like the third or fourth day, I'm like, I'm just gonna go for a hike. Like I don't want to do this, and I feel like if I'm sitting here forcing myself doing this, that actually makes me less creative. It's like I've made the space for it, but sometimes I need to go and gain inspiration, or sometimes I need to do something else that's going to spark an idea or stuff like that. Whereas, like other musicians I've talked to, some people, they're like, oh no, I like to sit there for like 12 hours, like doing this. And it's just like, I don't feel like either is like right or wrong. It seems more of just a how do you engage with this thing?
Hmm.
Like, and that's interesting. What happened to you that you said it led you to that place? Like when you were doing more 24/7 music, like what was your experience of that? That then you're like, that was too much. Like, and now it's like too little, but it's like, what made it like too much for you in that way?
Well, I think the problem was that I had finally gotten to the place where it was my job. I had a few years of being a musician full time, where it was my source of income,
Mm-hmm.
and with that pressure, uh, which was like the dream come true, um, made me feel like I had to think about music in a different way, and the pressure to have it be successful, successful enough to be able to pay the bills was
Um,
very tricky.
yeah, yeah. There's people that I've talked to about this. That we have this illusion of you're only a musician or you're only successful if it's paying your bills, whereas a lot of people I've talked to who said that they actually find that they're more successful and fulfilled in their music when they take the financial pressure off of the music. And like sometimes it actually does make them a fair bit of money, but that's almost like incidental to the process itself.
Hmm.
And it's like once you take that out of the equation, then you can actually have the relationship with music again.
That's what I think that's what I'm aiming for right now.
Yeah. Yeah. It's fascinating to me because I don't know if that informed your sense of identity as a musician. Like when we were talking about the sense of like, being an artist in that way, that it's like when that's taken off, then it like dethrones you from that artist role.
Yeah. I think because of Well, I mean, my parents were very supportive in their way, but I think I had a lot to prove in terms of my choice to be a musician full time.
Hmm.
And so I was racing towards the idea that like this was a living, this was a job where I could make a living and I could, support myself without having to do freelance, web design or graphic design on the side. And I could just make this work and have it be something where it wasn't even about me being proud of it. I could point to it and my parents could feel proud of it. And
Mm-hmm.
and so I was trying desperately to get to that place, and then I did get to that place, but it ended up being creatively quite tough
Yeah.
to maintain.
Yeah.
So
Well, and sometimes even when you get to the place that you thought you were aspiring to be, you're like, oh, I don't think that was actually the right place.
right,
Like,
right,
you get there and you're like, I thought I wanted that. I don't actually want that. Like, yeah, and that perception of success or financial stability due to music can put so much pressure, like you said, on the actual creativity of music.
yeah,
Yeah. That then it just kind of squishes it, because then instead of being focused on like, what is the song telling me? How am I feeling on this? Like, what new things do I want to try? It's more just like, oh, what are people going to think of this? Is this going to make this amount of money? And it's like, then you're just distracted from, like, no one's ever been like, gosh, I love listening to this song. It sounds so lucrative. Like, I was like, said no one ever. Like, so I can totally get that. Where like on one hand, I want to be like, congrats, you figured out how to make a living in music. And I'm also like, congrats, you decided like not to do that.
yeah.
So that makes a lot of sense. Well, I hope that in the near future you have the balance that feels good for you with
Thank you.
all of the different aspects there. Yeah.
Thanks. Yeah, me too.
Yeah. I was like, it's tricky.
Yeah, it feels closer now than it has in a long time.
I was like, tiny plotting hands. I'm like, good, yes. Yes. I was like, the evil plots of your success and happiness. Oh, well, thank you so much for coming by a virtual living room and hanging out and having a conversation. And like,
Thank you for having me.
thank you again for listening to this episode of Why Not Both? If you liked what you heard, please make sure to like us and subscribe to us on your preferred podcast platform. You can also come hang out with us on social media. We are at WNB the podcast, both on Instagram and on Twitter. This season, we are brought to you by Under the Radar magazine. Under the Radar is a nationally distributed print, music, and entertainment magazine and website. You can find them at www.undertheradarmag.com and feel free to support them on Patreon. Extra special thanks to our producer, Laura Studeris, who is literally a rock star. Thanks again, and I look forward to seeing you next episode.